James Walker woke up to the soft chirp of birds in the trees and the rustling of leaves in the cool morning breeze. It was a familiar sound he had grown used to over the years, a peaceful soundtrack to his life on the farm. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling the stretch of his muscles after a night's rest. The first light of dawn had just begun to touch the sky, painting it with hues of soft pink and orange. It was a quiet, calm day ahead, or so he thought. James lived alone on his farm, a piece of land passed down through generations in his family. He had built his life around this land, growing crops and raising animals. It wasn't easy work, but it was honest, and that's what mattered most to him. The soil, the animals, and the steady rhythm of farm life gave him a sense of peace. There were no distractions, no loud noises, just the hum of nature and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. He stood up from his bed and made his way to the kitchen. The old wooden floors creaked under his feet, a sound that was almost comforting in its familiarity. He quickly brewed a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the small kitchen. While waiting for the coffee, James glanced out the window at the fields stretching out before him. The crops were growing well, a testament to his hard work. He smiled, his day already feeling productive. Max, his dog, bounded into the kitchen, tail wagging enthusiastically. James chuckled as Max nudged him with his nose, demanding attention. He reached down to pet him, feeling the dog's soft fur under his hand. Max had been with him for years, ever since James had found the pup abandoned by the side of the road as a young dog. Since then, the two had been inseparable. Max was more than just a dog to James, he was family. Loyal, protective, and always by his side, the dog had a unique way of making everything better, even on the toughest days. James gave Max a quick scratch behind the ears and smiled. "You ready for a long day, boy?" he said softly. Max's response was a happy bark, followed by a wag of his tail. James laughed and poured his coffee into a mug. He sat down at the old wooden table, taking a sip, savoring the warmth. He had a list of things to do today: check the fence, water the crops, and give the animals their feed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him busy. He finished his coffee quickly, knowing there was no time to waste. With a deep breath, he stood up, grabbed his boots from the corner, and slipped them on. Max followed him eagerly as James stepped out the door and into the crisp morning air. The sun was rising higher now, casting a golden light over the fields. James walked down the dirt path, Max trotting happily by his side, always alert, always ready. The sound of his boots crunching on the gravel was the only noise that filled the air, the peaceful start to another day on the farm. The first stop was the barn. James opened the creaky door and entered, where the animals were already awake and waiting for their breakfast. The cows were lowing softly, the chickens clucked, and the horses neighed as they saw him. James loved the simplicity of farm life, the way the animals depended on him. It made him feel useful, important even. He had no illusions about being a farmer. It was hard work, it was sweaty, it was often lonely, but it was real. And that's what he liked most about it. He set to work, scooping feed into the troughs for the cows and chickens. Max sat by his feet, his eyes watchful, always scanning the surroundings. James had come to appreciate Max's alertness over the years. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, always on edge when danger was near. He trusted Max more than anything else. After feeding the animals, James spent some time in the barn, making sure everything was in order. The roof didn't leak, the hay was stacked high, and the tools were where they should be. Everything was as it should be. By the time he finished, the sun was high in the sky, signaling it was time for him to move on to the next task: checking the fence. The fence was a crucial part of his farm. Without it, the animals could wander off, and the crops could be destroyed by wild animals. It wasn't glamorous work, but it had to be done. James grabbed his toolbox and a few rolls of wire, setting off toward the back of the property where the fence line ran. As he walked through the fields, he couldn't help but admire the beauty around him. The corn stalks swayed in the breeze, their leaves rustling like a soft whisper. The earth smelled fresh and alive, filled with the promise of another successful season. James stopped for a moment to look around, taking in the view of his land. He'd worked hard to build his farm, and while it wasn't the biggest or most prosperous farm in the area, it was his. And that was enough for him. Max was always with him, staying close by as he worked. The dog's ears perked up suddenly, and his eyes focused on something in the distance. James followed Max's gaze but saw nothing unusual. It was odd, though. Max had always been quick to sense anything out of place. James gave the dog a quick glance, but shrugged it off. Maybe it was nothing. The fields were quiet today, and James preferred it that way. But the stillness wouldn't last long. Unbeknownst to James, the police operation was already in motion. The officers had misidentified the farm as the target of a criminal investigation, and they were making their way toward his property. They had received tips, though they were completely wrong. The police had come to the wrong conclusion about James, and now they were heading to his land, unaware of the man they were about to disturb. As James knelt down to fix a loose wire on the fence, Max's ears perked up again. This time, the dog was more on edge. He growled softly under his breath, and James could feel the tension in the air. Max's instinct had always been sharp, and now, for the first time, James felt a strange chill run down his spine. Something was wrong. Before he could react, the sound of tires crunching on the gravel road reached his ears. The unmistakable hum of a car engine drew closer. James stood up slowly, glancing toward the road. But what he saw next made his heart skip a beat. Several police cars appeared at the edge of his property, their sirens off, but their lights flashing. Officers were stepping out of the vehicles, weapons in hand. James froze for a moment, not sure what was happening. Why were the police here? What had he done wrong? Max, sensing danger, began barking furiously, his body tense and alert. James could feel his pulse quicken as he turned to face the officers. His peaceful morning was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the sound of police cars grew louder, James stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what was happening. His peaceful morning, the simple rhythm of farm life, was suddenly interrupted by something he couldn't understand. The police had arrived on his property, and Max, his loyal dog, was barking frantically as if he sensed the danger before James did. James tried to call to Max, but his voice was drowned out by the noise of the officers getting out of their cars. He could see them moving in groups, walking toward him with purpose, their uniforms stiff and their faces grim. At first, he thought they must have made some mistake after all. He had never been in trouble with the law, never caused anyone harm. His farm had always been a place of hard work and quiet living. "Hey! What's going on here?" James called out, hoping to get some kind of explanation. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes scanning the officers as they approached. He could feel the tension in the air, heavy and thick like a storm was about to break. Max continued barking, but James, concerned about the safety of his dog, reached down to hold the dog's collar, trying to calm him. But the officers weren't responding to his question. They just kept coming forward, their eyes locked on him. One of them raised his hand in a signal to stop, and then another officer stepped forward, his hand resting near the gun on his belt. James felt his heart race. The situation was escalating, and he couldn't understand why. "Sir," the officer spoke in a firm voice, his tone professional but filled with a sense of authority that made James uneasy. "Step away from the dog. We need you to stay calm." James's eyes narrowed as he looked at the officer. "What's happening here? Why are you on my farm?" he asked again, trying to keep his voice steady despite the confusion building inside him. The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward his fellow officers, and they began positioning themselves around James in a way that made him feel trapped. There was no way out now, no space to move. James could see Max still barking wildly, his body tense and ready to protect his owner. For a brief moment, James felt a rush of frustration and fear, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sense of concern for Max. "Max, calm down, boy," James whispered as he tried to soothe the dog with a low voice, but it wasn't working. The dog was too agitated, too aware of the threat. One of the officers, a tall man with a strong build, moved a little closer to James. His hand was still near his weapon, and James noticed his eyes flicker toward Max, who was continuing to bark in an almost frantic manner. It was then that James realized something. They weren't just here for a routine visit, they were here to take action, and it felt like they were treating him like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. "Stay calm, sir," the officer repeated. His voice wasn't quite as steady now, and James could see that there was a slight shift in the officer's demeanor. He was starting to look unsure, but it didn't matter. The tension was already too high. Max suddenly lunged forward, pulling on the leash James had wrapped around his hand. His barks grew louder, and he started to growl, sensing the danger the officers posed. James was about to say something to calm Max down, but before he could get the words out, one of the officers reacted. In a split second, the officer drew his weapon and aimed it at the dog. Everything seemed to slow down in that moment. James's heart skipped a beat, and his mind raced. He couldn't believe what was happening. His dog, Max, had only been defending him, doing what any loyal dog would do in a situation where its owner was threatened. Yet here, in front of him, was an officer preparing to take Max down. "Wait. No!" James shouted, taking a step forward, but it was too late. The sound of a gunshot rang out, and James's stomach dropped. He turned his head just in time to see Max collapse to the ground. The dog let out a whimper, a soft cry that seemed to echo in the silence that followed. James rushed forward, kneeling beside Max, his hands trembling as he gently tried to pick the dog up. Max's breathing was shallow, and his eyes were wide, filled with pain and confusion. "Max, no," James whispered, tears stinging his eyes. He could feel the weight of the moment, the injustice of it all, crashing down on him. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a senseless act that had destroyed his morning and his trust in the world around him. How could this happen? Why would the police do this? It didn't make sense. The officers stood by, watching, but no one came to help. No one stepped forward to check on the dog or offer any kind of apology. They just stood there, their faces unreadable, as James cradled Max in his arms. Max's body was still warm, but the light in his eyes was fading. James could feel the weight of the loss pressing on him like a heavy burden, but he couldn't give up. Not yet. "You've made a huge mistake," James said, his voice shaking with both anger and grief. He looked up at the officers, his eyes hardening. "You've taken something from me. My dog was just trying to protect me." The officer who had fired the shot stepped forward, his expression tense. He seemed to want to say something, but there were no words. Instead, he just looked down at the ground, avoiding James's gaze. The silence between them was deafening. "I didn't mean to," the officer began, but James cut him off. "Don't tell me you didn't mean to," James spat. "You pulled the trigger. You shot him without thinking. You didn't even give him a chance." Max let out one last breath, and James felt his heart break. The dog was gone. The animal who had been his companion for so many years, the one who had always been there for him, was now lying lifeless in his arms. And for what? Because the police had come here, unannounced, without understanding the situation, without even asking questions. They had come here with their guns drawn, ready to make a move without thinking about the consequences. James felt a rush of emotion: grief, anger, frustration, and a deep sense of betrayal. The farm that had once felt like a sanctuary was now filled with tension and confusion. What had started as a quiet day was now an overwhelming nightmare. The officers stood by, their silence speaking louder than words. James didn't care about their apologies or their explanations. It didn't matter anymore. His dog was gone, and nothing could bring him back. Max had always been there, a constant presence in James's life, and now he was gone. The weight of the loss was overwhelming, and James could feel the anger rising within him. They had taken something precious from him, something irreplaceable. And there was no way he could let them get away with it. The situation was far from over, but James knew that nothing would ever be the same again. James sat there, holding Max in his arms, unable to process what had just happened. The warmth of his dog's body was starting to fade, and with each passing moment, the weight of his loss grew heavier. The officers stood around him, their faces unreadable, their silence making everything feel worse. No one seemed to understand the pain he was going through. No one had said a word of apology or offered help. They had come here, done something unforgivable, and now they just watched him grieve, as if he were the one who had done something wrong. For a moment, all James could do was sit there, lost in his own grief. The once peaceful farm that he had worked so hard to build now felt like a hollow place, a place of sorrow. The sun was still shining brightly, but it didn't feel warm anymore. Everything seemed distant, out of reach, as if the world had shifted in an instant, and James was left in the middle of it all, confused and hurt. Max's body was still in his arms, and though James wanted to yell at the officers, he knew that nothing would bring his dog back. He couldn't change what had happened. But what he could do was stand up for what was right. He had to make sure that what the officers had done to him and his dog didn't go unnoticed. They couldn't just walk away from this, leaving him with nothing but a broken heart and a farm that no longer felt like home. Slowly, James stood up, cradling Max's body in his arms. He could feel the weight of the dog's stillness, the absence of life, and it made his chest ache. The officers still stood in a loose formation around him, their eyes fixed on him but offering no comfort. James felt a surge of anger rise within him. They hadn't even tried to understand the situation. They hadn't made an effort to talk to him, to see that his dog was simply trying to protect him. They had come here, guns drawn, without hesitation, and now his dog was dead. Why did you do this? James's voice was strained, the question hanging in the air. You came here, with no reason, no justification, and you shot my dog. What is wrong with you? The officer who had fired the shot looked down at the ground, his face pale. James could see the guilt in his eyes, but it didn't help. The damage had been done. The officer opened his mouth, as if he were about to say something, but no words came out. The silence between them grew thick, suffocating. We thought your dog was a threat, the officer finally said, his voice shaking. He was aggressive, and we were just trying to what? James interrupted, his voice rising with frustration. Trying to protect yourselves from a dog who was only trying to protect me? What could you possibly think, coming onto my land with weapons and no idea what's going on? The officer's face flushed with embarrassment, but still, he didn't offer an apology. James could see it in the officer's eyes, the same vacant look he had seen in others when they made mistakes but refused to admit them. He wasn't sorry. He was just trying to cover his tracks. We were following orders, another officer muttered quietly, his hands still clenched at his sides. It was as if he was trying to justify what had happened, as if there were any way to explain what they had done. Orders. James repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. You followed orders to kill my dog. It didn't make sense. James could feel the anger building up inside him, boiling over. How could they treat him like this? He was just a man trying to live his life in peace. He had done nothing wrong, and yet, his dog was dead because of their careless actions. James looked down at Max's lifeless body one last time, his heart heavy with sorrow. Max had been more than just a dog to him. He had been a friend, a companion, a protector. Now, he was gone, and there was nothing James could do to change it. Is that how it works? James continued, his voice now steady but firm. You just show up, make assumptions, and take lives without even asking questions. You've taken something from me, something I can never get back. The officers stood there, their heads bowed, unable to meet his gaze. The guilt was written all over their faces, but it didn't change anything. James could see it, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to undo the harm they had caused. I'm going to make sure this doesn't go unnoticed, James said, his voice hardening. I'm going to make sure the world knows what you did. The officers didn't say anything in response. They just looked at each other, exchanging glances as if unsure what to do next. James could feel the weight of their silence pressing down on him. It was as if they were waiting for him to accept what had happened, to let it go. But he couldn't. Not this time. Not after what they had done. He turned on his heel and began walking toward the house, still holding Max's body in his arms. The officers followed at a distance, their presence like a shadow hanging over him. James's mind was racing, but he was determined now. He wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to let them get away with what they had done. As he entered the house, he carefully laid Max's body on the floor, a sense of finality settling over him. The room felt cold, even though the sun was still shining brightly outside. James stood over his dog, his heart heavy with grief, but also filled with a quiet rage that he couldn't ignore. He knew that this wasn't just about Max. This wasn't just about the loss of his dog. This was about something bigger. It was about accountability. It was about making sure that people who were supposed to protect him didn't just take his life away because they felt like it. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number for his lawyer, his fingers trembling slightly as he held the phone to his ear. It felt like the right thing to do, taking action, seeking justice. "Hello, this is James Walker," he said when the line picked up. "I need your help. The police came to my farm today, and they killed my dog. I want to make sure they're held accountable for what they've done." The words felt heavy, but they were necessary. He had to speak up, not just for Max, but for everyone who had ever been hurt by a system that didn't care. James wasn't going to let this injustice go unchallenged. He wasn't going to let Max's death be in vain. As he hung up the phone, he looked back at the dog, his heart aching. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready. He would fight for what was right. He wouldn't let them take everything from him. Days passed since that tragic morning. The once peaceful routine of James's life on the farm had been shattered, leaving him in a state of constant unease. Max's absence weighed heavily on him, and though he tried to carry on with the work he had done for years, everything felt different. The simple tasks that once brought him comfort now felt meaningless. The house seemed emptier, the fields quieter. He couldn't escape the image of Max, lifeless in his arms, and the way everything had turned upside down so quickly. But James wasn't the kind of man to give up. He had lost something precious, something irreplaceable, but he knew he had to do something with the anger and grief that were eating at him. He had to make sure this wasn't just another story that was forgotten in the wake of a tragedy. He needed justice, not just for Max, but for the countless others who had suffered because of an unjust system. The news of the shooting spread quickly through the town. James's phone rang off the hook, with friends, neighbors, and even strangers reaching out to offer their condolences. Some were angry, some were sad, but all of them shared the same sense of disbelief. They knew James. They knew he was a man of integrity, a man who kept to himself and lived quietly on his farm. For something like this to happen to him, it felt wrong to everyone who knew him. James was contacted by local news outlets, eager to hear his side of the story. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't sure he wanted to relive the painful moment of that morning. He wasn't sure he could keep his composure in front of cameras and reporters. But as the days passed, he realized that telling his story was the only way to keep the truth alive. He couldn't let the police sweep this under the rug. He couldn't let Max's death be forgotten, not when it was so clear that the officers had acted without thinking, without understanding. He agreed to an interview. The reporter arrived early one morning, a young woman with a kind face who introduced herself as Sarah. She was professional but compassionate, aware of the heavy emotions James was carrying. She set up her camera in the living room, and after a brief introduction, she started the interview. "James," Sarah began, her voice soft but clear, "thank you for agreeing to speak with me. I know this is difficult, but we want to make sure your side of the story is heard. Can you tell me what happened that morning?" James took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He looked around the room, as if the walls would offer him some comfort. He could feel the pressure of the moment, but he knew he had to speak. "They came here like they were hunting criminals," he said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know what they thought they were going to find, but they never took the time to ask questions. They just showed up, guns drawn, like they were ready for a fight. They didn't care about me, or about Max. They were too quick to assume something was wrong." Sarah nodded, taking a moment to write down some notes. She looked up at James, her expression understanding. "And when they shot Max," she asked gently, "what went through your mind?" James's eyes clouded over with emotion. He paused for a moment, his hands resting in his lap. He hadn't spoken about Max's death like this before, not in such a direct way. "I couldn't believe it," James replied quietly. I thought maybe they'd make a mistake, that they'd see I wasn't a threat, that they'd see Max wasn't a threat. But they didn't. They just shot him. It happened so fast. 1 second, he was there, barking, trying to protect me. The next second, he was gone." He choked back a tear but refused to let it fall. He wasn't going to let the grief consume him, not when he had a chance to make things right. "And since then, how have things changed for you?" Sarah asked, her voice still gentle but probing. James looked out the window, his gaze distant. "It's like I'm living in a different world now. The farm doesn't feel the same. The fields don't seem as green. The quiet that used to be peaceful is now just eerie. Max was more than just a dog to me. He was family. And now I have to figure out how to move on without him. But I'm not going to let this go. Not after what they did." As he spoke, James's resolve grew stronger. The weight of the loss was still there, deep in his chest, but now there was something else, something he hadn't felt before: determination. He wasn't just going to sit back and let the officers who had killed Max walk away without consequences. He was going to make sure his voice was heard, and he was going to make sure that people knew what had happened. Later that day, Sarah's report aired on the local news. James had said what he needed to say, and he could already feel the ripple effect. People were talking about it. The town was talking about it. Even people who didn't know him were calling, offering support. But it wasn't just the town that was paying attention. News outlets from outside the area picked up the story, and soon, James's face was on television screens across the state. His phone rang constantly, the sound of it ringing becoming almost a comfort in its familiarity. People were reaching out to him from all over, some sharing their own stories of police misconduct, others simply offering their sympathy. But as the attention grew, so did the pressure. The police department could no longer pretend that nothing had happened. They had to respond. And respond they did. James received a letter from the police chief, apologizing for the incident and offering compensation for the loss of his dog. The apology felt hollow, empty. The compensation, though well-meaning, couldn't bring Max back. James wasn't interested in money. What he wanted was accountability. What he wanted was for the officers involved to understand the harm they had caused, not just to him, but to his community. He wanted the police to know that they couldn't act with such disregard for life and get away with it. He called his lawyer again, his voice firm and determined. "I'm not accepting their apology," he said. "I'm going to take this as far as I need to. They need to understand that what they did was wrong, and I'm not backing down." The lawyer agreed, and they began preparing for the next step. James knew the road ahead would be long. He knew that this wasn't going to be easy, that there would be people who tried to undermine his story, to make it seem like Max had been in the wrong. But he also knew that he couldn't let this injustice stand. He wasn't just fighting for his dog anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been hurt by a system that didn't care. He was fighting for a future where people like him, people who just wanted to live in peace, didn't have to fear those who were supposed to protect them. And as he prepared for the next steps, he found something else he hadn't expected: hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. The people who had reached out to him, the people who had supported him, gave him the strength to keep going. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The days turned into weeks, and the fight James had started for justice had only intensified. He had made the decision not to back down, not to let Max's death be swept under the rug like so many other tragedies before it. With the support of his lawyer, friends, and community, James was now moving forward with a lawsuit against the police department. He wasn't sure how long it would take, or how it would end, but he knew one thing for certain: he was going to see this through, no matter the cost. The media attention didn't fade either. Every day, it seemed like there was a new article or news segment about the situation. The story had taken on a life of its own. People from across the country were following it, rallying behind James and his cause. But there were also voices that tried to downplay the situation, claiming that the officers had been in the right, that Max had posed a threat. But those voices were in the minority. Most people saw the injustice for what it was, and they stood with James. James's lawyer worked tirelessly, preparing the case for court. They needed every detail, every piece of evidence to make sure they had a strong argument. They combed through the police records, reviewed the footage from nearby surveillance cameras, and interviewed witnesses. It wasn't easy. The police department tried to make excuses, but there were cracks in their story that James's legal team was ready to expose. The pressure was beginning to take its toll on James. Though he had a strong support system, there were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The pain of losing Max had never truly gone away. There were times when he would be out in the fields, working alone, and he would hear the faint rustling of leaves behind him, only to turn around and realize it was just the wind. He'd forgotten, for a split second, that Max wasn't there to walk beside him anymore. But as much as the pain hurt, there was something else driving him. Something stronger than grief. His desire for justice was unwavering. He couldn't let Max's death be in vain. He couldn't let this injustice go unchallenged. There were too many people who had been hurt by systems like this, and if he could change even one thing, it would be worth it. As the trial date approached, James found himself facing even more challenges. The police department had hired a top lawyer, someone known for getting the department out of tight spots. It felt like the odds were stacking up against him. But James didn't flinch. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for the entire community. For anyone who had ever felt powerless or overlooked. The day of the trial finally arrived. James stood outside the courthouse, his lawyer by his side, surrounded by supporters holding signs that read "Justice for Max" and "End Police Brutality." It was a sea of people, all there for one cause: to make sure that what happened to James didn't happen again. James could feel the weight of the moment, the pressure building inside him. He wasn't sure how the trial would unfold, but he knew this was the right thing to do. Inside the courthouse, the tension was palpable. The courtroom was packed with people, reporters, and even some curious bystanders. The police department had brought in their best lawyer, a slick man who spoke with a calm, collected voice that seemed to ooze confidence. James's lawyer was quieter, more deliberate, but just as determined. The judge, an older man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, called the court to order, and the trial began. The first few hours were filled with procedural matters, but soon, the arguments began. James's lawyer spoke first, presenting the case with a quiet intensity that caught the attention of everyone in the room. He described how James had been going about his daily routine, how Max had been a beloved part of the family, and how the officers had acted recklessly, firing without cause. He showed the surveillance footage, the video footage from James's own cameras, and the witness statements that all pointed to the same conclusion: the police had made a tragic mistake. The defense tried to argue that the officers had been justified in their actions, that they had acted in fear for their safety. But James's lawyer was prepared. He pointed out that the officers had been given no reason to fear. Max had been a dog defending his home, not a threat. There was no indication that the situation had escalated to the point where deadly force was needed. As the trial continued, James could feel the tide turning in his favor. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the defense made sharp, cutting remarks, trying to undermine his character or the details of his story. But James stayed focused. He didn't let the defense's tactics get to him. He had a mission, and he couldn't lose sight of it. The most emotional part of the trial came when James took the stand. He had never been in a courtroom like this before. He had never imagined himself speaking in front of so many people, especially not in a setting like this. But when he stood there, looking out at the judge and the jury, something inside him clicked. He took a deep breath and began to speak. He spoke about Max, about how the dog had been there for him through thick and thin. He spoke about the bond they had shared, about how Max had been more than just a dog, he had been family. He talked about how the shooting had changed his life, how it had shattered the trust he had in the people who were supposed to protect him. His voice cracked a few times, but he held it together. He had to. When he finished speaking, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The jury looked at him with sympathy, but also with respect. James had spoken the truth, and it had resonated with them. His pain was real, his grief undeniable. But so was his determination. He wasn't there to point fingers. He wasn't there to make anyone feel guilty. He was there to make sure that no one else had to go through what he had gone through. That no one else had to lose something as precious as Max. After closing arguments, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. James sat in the courtroom, surrounded by his lawyer and supporters, but all he could do was wait. The waiting felt like it would never end. He looked around the room at the faces of the people who had come to support him, and he felt a sense of gratitude. He wasn't alone in this fight. He had the support of his community, of people who understood that what happened to him wasn't just about one dog. It was about accountability, about the need for change, about making sure the mistakes of the past didn't repeat themselves. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned. The foreman stood and read the verdict: guilty. The officers were found to have acted recklessly, and the police department was held accountable for the loss of James's dog. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. It was justice. James felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by the quiet, deep feeling of accomplishment. It wasn't just for Max, it was for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that didn't care. As he left the courtroom, James looked up at the sky, the sun shining brightly overhead. He had won, but more importantly, he had taken a stand. and no matter what the future held, he knew that he had done the right thing.